June 5, 1942. Dawn breaks over the Pacific Ocean, but the light brings no relief. The waters near Midway Atoll are stained with oil and debris. Smoke rises from the horizon like funeral pyres reaching toward an indifferent sky. Aboard the heavy cruiser Nagara, a man stands alone on the bridge, staring at the devastation that surrounds him. His name is Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Just 24 hours ago, he commanded the most powerful naval strike force the world had ever seen. 4 aircraft carriers, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor with devastating precision 6 months earlier. Now, all 4 rest at the bottom of the Pacific, taking with them over 3,000 men, 300 aircraft, and something far more intangible, Japan's invincibility. As the morning light grows stronger, witnesses report seeing something unprecedented. The Admiral, a man forged in the rigid traditions of the Imperial Navy, a warrior who had led Japan's forces through triumph after triumph across the Pacific, begins to weep. Not quietly, not discreetly, but openly, his body shaking with sobs that echo across the bridge. This is the story of the Japanese admiral who cried after Midway, a story of hubris, miscalculation, and the exact moment when the tide of the Pacific War turned forever. This is the story of how the most successful naval commander in Japanese history found himself witnessing the destruction of everything he had built, and how one battle transformed the course of World War II. To understand why Admiral Nagumo wept that morning, we must first understand what he had been. Chuichi Nagumo was not a natural carrier admiral. Born in 1887 in Yamagata Prefecture, he had risen through the ranks as a torpedo and destroyer specialist, a surface warfare expert in an era when aircraft carriers were still considered experimental. He was cautious, methodical, and deeply traditional. Some would later say these traits made him the wrong man for the fast-paced, dynamic world of carrier warfare. But by December 1941, Nagumo commanded the Kido Butai, the first air fleet, the most formidable naval aviation force ever assembled. 6 aircraft carriers formed its core: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. Over 400 aircraft, the best pilots in the world, veterans hardened by years of combat in China. This was the instrument that would strike the opening blow of Japan's Pacific campaign.
On December 7, 1941, Nagumo proved his critics wrong. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a masterpiece of naval aviation, a surgical strike that crippled the American Pacific Fleet. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed. Over 2,000 Americans were killed. The attack achieved complete surprise and tactical perfection. Nagumo returned to Japan a hero, showered with honors and praise. The months that followed were a symphony of Japanese victories. Nagumo's carriers swept through the Pacific like a typhoon. Wake Island fell, the Philippines fell. Singapore, the impregnable British fortress, surrendered in what Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. Nagumo's aircraft struck as far as Ceylon in the Indian Ocean, sinking British carriers and sending the Royal Navy fleeing westward. By April 1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from Burma to the Gilbert Islands, from the Aleutians to Java. The rising sun flew over territory containing nearly 500 million people and vast resources of oil, rubber, and strategic minerals. The Western powers seemed helpless before Japan's military might. And at the center of this unprecedented expansion stood Admiral Nagumo and his carriers, undefeated, seemingly invincible. But empires built quickly often rest on shallow foundations. The decision to attack Midway Atoll didn't originate with Nagumo. It came from Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. Yamamoto understood something many Japanese leaders didn't. Japan could not win a prolonged war against America's industrial might. The only hope was to deliver such devastating blows that America would negotiate peace. Pearl Harbor had destroyed battleships, but missed the American carriers. They had been at sea during the attack. Yamamoto knew these carriers represented the real threat. He needed to lure them into a decisive battle where Japan's superior naval aviation could destroy them completely.
Midway was the bait. This tiny atoll, just over 1,000 miles northwest of Hawaii,
held an American airbase. Yamamoto reasoned that an attack on Midway would force the American carriers to respond, and when they did, Nagumo's Kido Butai would be waiting to annihilate them. The plan was complex, perhaps too complex. It involved multiple task forces, diversionary attacks in the Aleutians, and precise timing. Intelligence suggested the Americans might have 2 carriers available, possibly 3. Japanese wargames predicted the loss of 1 or 2 Japanese carriers, but Yamamoto deemed this acceptable for the destruction of America's carrier force. What Japanese intelligence didn't know was that American codebreakers had cracked Japan's naval codes. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding American forces in the Pacific, knew about the Midway operation. He knew the Japanese plan. He knew approximately when they would strike, and he prepared accordingly. If you're enjoying this journey through history, remember to subscribe to WW2 Last Stand, where we bring forgotten battles, hidden stories, and untold final stands of World War II back to life. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Admiral Nagumo had every reason for confidence. His fleet approached Midway under cover of fog and weather fronts. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented the cream of Japanese naval aviation. 248 aircraft, the best pilots, the most experienced crews. 2 other carriers, damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea, were absent, but Nagumo still commanded overwhelming force. At 4:30 a.m., the first wave launched, 108 aircraft heading for Midway's airbase. Nagumo held back a second wave, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for anti-ship operations in case American carriers appeared. This was doctrine, this was prudent, this was careful planning. The attack on Midway achieved its objectives. The base was heavily damaged, but the strike leader radioed back a troubling message. There is need for a second attack. The island's defenses remained operational. Its airstrip could still launch aircraft. Nagumo faced a decision. His reserve aircraft sat on the hangar decks, armed for naval combat. Rearming them for a second land attack would take time, perhaps 90 minutes. During that time, his carriers would be vulnerable. But he had seen no evidence of American carriers. Japanese reconnaissance had found nothing. Intelligence suggested the Americans were still days away. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo made his choice. He ordered the reserve aircraft rearmed for a second strike on Midway. Torpedoes were removed and replaced with land bombs. Armor-piercing shells were swapped for high explosives. On the hangar decks of 4 carriers, ordnance crews worked frantically, stacking removed torpedoes and bombs wherever space allowed. 15 minutes later, everything changed. A Japanese reconnaissance plane, launched late due to catapult problems, radioed a devastating message. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships. Nagumo's blood must have run cold. Surface ships meant possible carriers. He immediately ordered the rearming stopped, but confusion reigned. The aircraft were caught halfway between configurations. Some had land bombs, some had nothing, some were still being worked on. The hangars were cluttered with ordnance. The decks were crowded with aircraft unable to launch. More reports trickled in. The American ships included carriers, at least 1, maybe more. By 9 a.m., Nagumo decided to recover his Midway strike force before launching any counterattack. His pilots were low on fuel. They needed to land. Once they were aboard and the decks were clear, he could launch a properly coordinated strike against the American carriers. It was logical. It was prudent. It was exactly what doctrine demanded. It was also fatal. The Americans were desperate. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16, had launched everything he had at the Japanese carriers. But coordination was impossible. American aircraft arrived piecemeal, scattered, uncoordinated. The first attacks were catastrophic failures. Torpedo bombers from the carriers Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown went in low and slow, making them easy targets for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked, only 6 survived. Not a single torpedo hit. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the defending fighters, shot them down like target practice. But those torpedo bombers had drawn the Japanese fighters down to sea level, and they had pulled the defending fighters away from their carriers. At 10:22 a.m., 3 things happened almost simultaneously. The Japanese carriers were in the process of recovering aircraft. Their decks were crowded. Their hangars were full of armed and fueled aircraft and stacks of ordnance. Their defending fighters were at low altitude, having just slaughtered the torpedo bombers. From high altitude, unseen and unopposed, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown rolled into their attacks. The first bomb struck Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, at 10:26 a.m. It penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the hangar among armed aircraft in Stack's ordnance. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship. Within minutes, Akagi was a floating inferno. At almost the same moment, Kaga took 4 direct hits. The first blew up a fully fueled aircraft on the flight deck. The explosion ignited a chain reaction through the ship. Kaga's captain would be dead within hours. Soryu lasted slightly longer. 3 bombs hit in rapid succession. One penetrated to the hangar deck and ignited aircraft armed for the second Midway strike. The explosions blew out the sides of the ship. In 5 minutes, just 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers had been transformed from instruments of war into floating pyres. The pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor, who had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, either died in the flames or watched helplessly from the air as their ships burned. Only Hiryu remained operational. Its aircraft launched a counterstrike that heavily damaged the American carrier Yorktown. But Hiryu's victory was brief. American dive bombers found her that afternoon and delivered the same treatment, 4 direct hits that started uncontrollable fires. By sunset, all 4 Japanese carriers were dead or dying. Hiryu would be scuttled the next morning. The others burned through the night, finally slipping beneath the waves after their crews were evacuated. Admiral Nagumo, who had transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara after Akagi became uninhabitable, watched it all. The flames, the explosions, the rescue operations pulled burned and wounded men from the water, the slow, agonizing death of each carrier. And that's when witnesses saw him break.
In the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese Navy, displays of emotion were considered weakness. Officers were expected to maintain stoic composure regardless of circumstances. The Bushido Code, that still influenced military culture, demanded emotional control, acceptance of fate, and unwavering commitment to duty. But on the morning of June 5th, as the last of his carriers slipped beneath the waves, Admiral Nagumo wept openly. Staff officers reported seeing tears streaming down his face. His shoulders shook with sobs. He made no attempt to hide his grief. For a man of his generation and position, this was unprecedented. It wasn't just the loss of ships or men, though over 3,000 sailors and airmen had died. It wasn't just the tactical defeat, though Midway represented Japan's first major naval reverse of the war. Nagumo was crying because he understood, perhaps before anyone else in the Japanese high command, what had just happened. In 5 minutes, Japan had lost its offensive capability in the Pacific. Those 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, represented not just ships, but 6 months of intensive training, years of accumulated experience, irreplaceable pilots, and the core of Japan's naval aviation strike capability. Japan could build new carriers. It would, though industrial constraints meant it would take years. But it couldn't replace the pilots, the experience, the institutional knowledge that went down with those ships. The veterans of Pearl Harbor, of the Indian Ocean raids, of countless victories. Gone. More fundamentally, Nagumo understood that the strategic initiative had shifted. Japan's plan had been to knock out American naval power quickly, secure the resource zones of Southeast Asia, and establish a defensive perimeter too costly for America to break. Midway was supposed to complete the strategy by eliminating America's carrier force. Instead, America had 3 carriers still operational. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown had been damaged, but would be repaired. Japan had lost its 4 most capable carriers and its most experienced air groups. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted in a single morning. Some historians have been critical of Nagumo's tears, seeing them as a sign of weakness or a breakdown of command. But perhaps his tears demonstrated something else, a clarity of vision that many Japanese leaders lacked. Nagumo had been at Pearl Harbor. He had witnessed Japan's string of victories, and now he had witnessed the beginning of the end. The tide had turned, and Nagumo knew it. The Battle of Midway proved to be the turning point of the Pacific War. Japan would fight on for 3 more years, with desperate ferocity and terrible cost. But after Midway, Japan never regained the offensive. Every subsequent operation was defensive, reactive, fighting to hold what had already been taken. For Admiral Nagumo, the burden of Midway followed him for the rest of his life. He never commanded carriers again. The IJN, looking for scapegoats, sidelined him despite his previous successes. He was given less prestigious commands, first a battleship squadron, then shore-based operations. In July 1944, Nagumo was in command of forces on Saipan when American forces invaded. As the island fell and it became clear that Japanese defeat was inevitable, Nagumo chose the path expected of a Japanese officer. On July 6, 1944, he committed suicide rather than face capture. He died believing he had failed his country, his navy, and his emperor. But history's judgment is more nuanced. Nagumo was placed in an impossible situation at Midway: a complex operational plan, inadequate intelligence, and decisions that had to be made with incomplete information under time pressure. Many of the factors that led to defeat were beyond his control. The broken Japanese codes, the presence of 3 American carriers instead of the 2 Japanese intelligence predicted, the late-launched reconnaissance plan whose delayed report came at the worst possible moment, the incredible bravery of American torpedo bomber crews who sacrificed themselves to draw down the Japanese fighters, the timing that put American dive bombers over the Japanese carriers at the exact moment they were most vulnerable. Nagumo made mistakes. His decision to rearm aircraft for a second Midway strike left his carriers exposed. His lack of aggressive reconnaissance gave the Americans the first strike. His cautious nature sometimes hesitated when boldness was required. But he was also a man asked to do an almost impossible job with incomplete information and constrained resources. And when defeat came, when the consequences of all those factors converged in 5 terrible minutes, he understood immediately what it meant. That's why he cried.
The image of the Japanese admiral who cried after Midway has become a symbol of something larger than one man's grief. It represents the human cost of war, the weight of command, and the moment when reality shatters the illusion of invincibility. We remember the great battles through statistics: 4 carriers lost, 3,000 men killed, the turning point of the Pacific War. But battles are experienced by individuals, by pilots burning alive in carrier hangar decks, by young sailors drowning in fuel-slicked water, by commanders watching their plans collapse and their men die while knowing the weight of responsibility rests on their shoulders. Admiral Nagumo's tears remind us that on the other side of our history books, our documentaries, our analyses of strategy and tactics, were human beings, men who felt pride in victory and devastation in defeat, men who carried the weight of thousands of lives, men who understood, sometimes before anyone else, when the world had fundamentally changed. The Battle of Midway changed the course of World War II. It shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. It marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat toward eventual defeat. But for Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, standing on the deck of the cruiser Nagara on the morning of June 5, 1942, it was simply the end of everything he had built and the deaths of thousands of men under his command. And so he wept. Not in weakness, but in recognition. Recognition of what had been lost. Recognition of what it meant. Recognition that the war Japan thought it could win had just become a war it would almost certainly lose. His tears were prophetic. 3 years and 2 months later, Japan would surrender. The carriers that burned at Midway would never be replaced. The initiative lost that day would never be regained. And the admiral who understood this truth before most others would be dead, having taken his own life on a distant island as the empire he served collapsed around him. This is the untold story of World War II, not just of battles and strategy, but of the human beings who lived through those impossible moments and carried the weight of history on their shoulders.
The Pacific War is filled with stories like this, moments that changed history, decisions made under impossible pressure, and human beings caught in the machinery of the largest conflict the world has ever known. Here at WW2 Last Stand, we bring these forgotten battles, hidden stories, and untold final stands back to life. Subscribe to journey with us through the most pivotal moments of World War II. These stories deserve to be remembered. These men and women deserve to be honored. And these lessons of history deserve to be learned. Thank you for reading. And remember, history is not just dates and battles. It's people. It's a choice. It's consequences. It's an admiral standing on a cruiser deck at dawn, watching his carriers burn and understanding that everything has changed.